What's up everybody, welcome back to the channel and to another Outriders video. Today we're going to be looking at a build for the Technomancer that emphasizes sniping and using rifles, turrets and other abilities to keep enemies at bay while picking them off at a distance. This is a build that's been on the back burner for me for a while and I've finally managed to get all the pieces together, and I'd like to discuss that with you and basically tell you what works, what doesn't work. But if you do find this video useful or like it in any way, please do consider giving it a like, maybe subbing to the channel, perhaps even sharing the video with a buddy. It really does help the brand grow and it just means a whole lot to me. Without any further ado, let's go. Generally speaking, when we build a Technomancer in the firepower variant, of course we want to incorporate things like blighted rounds, simply due to the fact that this allows the Technomancer's damage to scale so very well, and is really one of the strong points about the Technomancer when you build it in a firepower configuration. Now when it comes to building into snipers, you can break away from that meta and concentrate on using things like turrets and cold snap to essentially keep enemies at bay so that you've got longer firing lanes and you can hit them from further away. That means then that this class setup, especially the one that I'm showing you today, is some weird kind of Frankenstein mix between what you would pick for a firepower Technomancer using blighted rounds, but not using blighted rounds, and dipping a little bit more into additional cold damage and additional control through the use of cold snap and the turrets. Overall, I'm really impressed with the amount of damage that this is able to push out, especially if you play solo, due to the fact that you can essentially one-shot almost everything that is of a non-captain, non-elite variety, and then the captain's elites and those take a little bit longer, maybe 2 to 4 shots to kill them, depending on how accurate you can be. Now, one caveat here, of course, is the fact that I'm playing on PC and therefore I'm using keyboard and mouse. So if you are not that good with landing accurate shots with a controller and you're playing on a console, then this build might end up being a little bit frustrating for you, simply due to the fact that you lose a lot of that additional damage that you get from hitting critical parts if you don't hit them. That would be the first problem. The second problem that I've encountered with this build is it is far more impressive using this in a solo, if you're just running by yourself, than it is playing in duos or trios. That's of course due to the fact that health scales, tremendously through the roof in duos and trios, especially in trios. And that's not necessarily the truth for when we look at how damage ramps up for this character or for most characters. Now, does that mean that this build is not viable for group play, duos or trios? Not at all. It absolutely works, especially if you do continue on playing this sort of sniper support role where you're sitting in the back and the guys in front and your turrets are essentially taking all of the heat off of you and you can concentrate on hitting those shots. I definitely would just recommend that you should probably be on host, because that'll definitely help you to get the headshots that you're looking for, and not for those enemies to already be dead or something like that due to, poor netcode or something like that. The only other thing I would also recommend is that you use your cold snap actually offensively and to help your teammates out and let them deal more damage, as well as enjoying the great CC that essentially comes from cold snap. So when it comes to the actual build, one thing that will probably be a little bit of a showstopper for you right at the beginning is getting the right weapon to use. Specifically for this build, I wanted a rifle that had one bullet in the chamber so that I could get the reload effect proccing every time for the specific mods that I wanted to choose. And then secondly, I'm not really that impressed by any of the rifles which are available from the legendary perspective. So I definitely think that if you are making this build work with any one of these legendary rifles, then it might change the configuration of what you're using ever so slightly. But what I did end up doing was, just sort of farming out a one-shot variant rifle that specifically had Snow Squall on it and that had a decent enough damage roll on it, and this is by far the best I could get. The other thing that I was really interested in is I wanted close range damage, long range damage and crit damage on it as well in its substats. So this depends on how lucky you are with RNG and how long it'll take you to find something like this, but this was a couple of weeks of actually looking for something that felt like this and that I could get to roll correctly. But nonetheless, this then fell with Snow Squall on it, and the reason why we want that on there is it means that your follow-up shots are going to be shooting a frozen target that you get all of the benefit of the other mods that we'll be looking at when we come to the gear on it. So it's just a great way for you to get far more additional damage on there, especially more additional damage to frozen or stuff that's freeze as a status on them. And then I pair that with grand opening, which of course means that every time when you reload, you chamber in one of these grand opening shots that when it hits for a 250k explosion to everything in a 5-meter radius. This is fantastically good at clearing out trash, especially if you freeze a bunch of things with cold snap and then hit them with one of these bullets and it sets off a chain reaction that ends up killing everything. So while there are different mod combinations that could probably work really well, this is something that I specifically wanted for this build, and so I'm glad that I was able to get that. Now, my other two weapons don't really matter that much because this is a sniper build, so you want to be using the sniper rifle as much as possible, as often as possible. The main problem is that you might run into situations where you run out of bullets because you're sitting all the way in the back and you're just sniping, and so you're not pushing forward on the map, so you're not picking up any ammo pickups that the enemies drop when you kill them. So if you're not cognizant of that, or if you're not used to playing sniper, then this will sort of like catch you off guard every once in a while, and you'll realize, oh shit, I just shot out 45 bullets and I haven't picked up new ammo and there's still enemies running at me. So it would be probably a good idea to pair this build with a weapon that is good at just pushing out a lot of damage to 1 or 2 enemies that are left, or at least to shoot at enemies while you run around and collect more ammo for your sniper rifle. So in other words, this pairs really well with something like a funeral pyre that has shadow comet and claymore torrent on it. It's a killing machine that kills groups of enemies or single enemies very easily with all the additional damage that it deals with the mods that are on there. So having something like this available as your fallback weapon when you don't have ammo for your sniper, or when there's just simply too many enemies to snipe, is a good idea. I never switched to my pistol, but on here I have a Torment in Agony with Moaning Winds and Clip Combustion on. Now, one of the two things to bear in mind is I don't use the Moaning Winds, switch meta on this at all. And secondly, we're also not using blighted rounds. So it doesn't really matter if you switch between weapons. It doesn't really matter if you run out of bullets because you can just pick up some more. But the main point is the majority of your DPS and really the focus of this build is around sniping. So you kind of want to make sure that you've got a decent sniper and that you've got bullets for it. Now, when we get over to the gear itself, I'm using 3-piece Borealis, of course. That's simply because Borealis is a great way for you to get additional damage squeezed into the build due to the additional damage that you deal to frozen targets, but also because the Borealis pieces, at least the 3 that I'm using, all roll with firepower and long range damage on them. And then you also have a variation of status power and cooldown reduction on those, which just help you also because those are all beneficial stats or substats for you to lean into. Of course, you want more firepower. Status power means that enemies are staying frozen longer, which gives you more than enough time to line up headshots and kill them. And then long range damage is just extra, cream on top in terms of you shooting enemies from far away. Now, on the crown of Borealis, the headpiece, I have twins on here, which lets me throw out 2 cryo turrets. Now, you deal a lot more damage against things that are frozen, so these cryo turrets are really important to freezing enemies and CCing them and then letting you get those headshots in. Now, on the second mod on here is Shatter, which is, as I said, we're leaning very heavily into dealing more damage against things that are frozen. So Shatter is just an additional 25% damage to that. And when we get over to the chest piece, here we have the one mod which we're using for cold snap on here, which is Icicle Storm. This basically means that every time when you blow up a guy that has been frozen by your cold snap, they will essentially become a little mini explosion that ignite all of the other frozen enemies around them. And this creates a chain reaction where you can freeze an entire group of enemies. You can hit an enemy on the side, he explodes, and all of those explosions cascade through the chain and kill everything. So again, a fantastic way, and I'm sure you saw that in the footage at the beginning when I was showcasing the build, where you can essentially just clear out entire rooms if you're lucky enough to get a good cold snap and hit them with that. Now over here we have Radical Therapy on, which means that we deal more damage against enemies that are toxic. Now, since we're not using blighted rounds on this, you might be thinking or might be asking, hold on, but this is kind of like wasted because we don't really have a way to make enemies have toxic on them. That's not entirely true. We do have 2 ways to get that onto them. Well, actually, no, let's focus on the primary way in which we can get toxic onto them. And that's simply the fact that we use a second turret on here, the blighted turret. And this actually sprays them with toxic. Now, you have to get a little bit more creative with this because the firing range of the cryo turrets is a lot more than the firing range of the blighted turrets. So always keep that in the back of your mind when you're spacing your turrets out, that you might want to throw the blighted turret a little bit further out than the cryo turrets. That's okay if the enemies pick on that turret and kill it, because the blighted turret's cooldown is also a lot faster than the cryo turrets. But the bottom line is you want to get the blighted turret close enough to them so that the blighted turret is also putting toxic on these enemies, so that you can enjoy this, additional damage. Now this all is kind of moot, because the point is, when we're talking about trash with this build, you are one-shotting those guys in any case, and that's if your turrets aren't murdering them outright. This only really matters for when you're engaging captains, elites, and bosses, so definitely get that blighted turret as close to that target as possible so they get toxic on them as well. Then when we go over to the pants here, we have Euthanize on here, which is again additional damage to stuff that's got toxic on them, and we have Freezing Boost on here, which is additional damage to stuff that's got frozen. So you can see what we're doing here. We're stacking our two elemental types as much as we can, so we can squeeze out as much as possible damage from that. Then over on the gloves, my stats that I'm looking for on my purple gear is firepower, long range damage, and status power. Cooldown reduction is not really that important. It doesn't hurt your build, because it means that you can refresh your turrets more often. But the way that this is set up right now, you have more than enough essentially cooldown reduction for your turrets to be available. The only other cool thing about stacking cooldown reduction is you get more uses out of your cold snap. You get more often the ability to use cold snap. But even in the way that we have it here, and I'll show you just now when we get to the class tree, you get a fairly decent cooldown on cold snap, and you're able to use it almost offensively and not just defensively. Now here we have the second mod for cold snap, and that's long winter. We are sniping with this class, so we want to be far away from enemies, so you want your cold snap to also be able to reach very far. So while this might be considered by some as a free mod, I definitely think the inclusion of cold snap is pretty good, because the fact is then you can hit enemies from that back row where you are standing behind your turret. You can freeze them and you can knock them out with the sniper rifle. Captain Anton here is really good because it gives you 25% additional damage against captains, elites, and bosses, and that's definitely needed to go from 6 to 7 shots to down a captain or elite to like 3 to 4, depending of course on how you cold snap them and hit them with other stuff. And last but not least, on the boots, you can see here I have anomaly power, cooldown reduction, and skills life leech. Now this is just particularly for this piece of gear here. I have this on. I don't really need this, and so you'll see that I have some other options here, like for instance things that I was trying to build around that. But the point is, yeah, of course, a firepower roll like the gloves would be good, a firepower roll with long range and status power. But for the sake of this build and me also sitting at 163k firepower, I feel like I'm not losing that much damage here, and it doesn't really make the difference for me between hitting with a like 3 shots downing a captain or elite, or 4 shots. That being said, the reason why I opted for this is because I wanted my cryo turrets to be a little bit more juicy, a little bit more crazy. And so basically here we have hail shot on here, which increases the cryo turret's damage by the amount of status power that you have. And since we are stacking status power on most of our pieces, 1, 2, 3 and 4, and yeah, we got 4 out of 5 status power. This actually gives those cryo turrets a little bit more bite. And then last but not least, I also put increased damage on here, which is that every turret shot from cryo turret gives you even some more damage on there. Now there are definitely some other options that you can put in. You can lean heavily into firepower and using things like sharp eye and those mods to further augment your damage. But when you build this, and if you try this out, and as certainly as you could have seen from the footage at the start, it's not really a problem in terms of like the damage that you're able to push out, because in favorable conditions where you have both of your debuffs on enemies, so they're frozen and they're toxic, you are still pulling off 1.2 1.4 million headshots on enemies from a distance, and you can just pump those out as long as you have ammo. So damage dealing is really not a problem, and you're able to kill bosses actually quite efficiently with this, especially due to the fact that you can lock them down ever so often with cold snap as well. When we go over to the skills, obviously then, as you could have surmised by now, we are using cryo turret, which is on a 15.7 second cooldown, and that's for 2 of them. Then we have blighted turret, which is on a 7.1 second cooldown, and then we have cold snap, which is on a 14.6, which is not a bad cooldown at all for this. Generally speaking, this means that you have about, I'd say about 10 seconds that enemies are not frozen by cold snap before you can hit them with the next one. But in the meanwhile, of course, your cryo turret is also dealing out some CC as well. And last but not least, we move over to the class tree. Now this has some weird kind of, you know, sort of mesh between the two class trees. And practically the reason for that, you might be thinking that you might want to lean heavily into top tree, because top tree is firepower, and this is after all a sniper build which uses firepower. The one problem is I wanted to keep the idea of having a sniper rifle that shoots, that's bless my wife. I wanted to keep a sniper rifle that is able to shoot and then reload and then get the grand opening effect and then shoot and then reload. So if we, for instance, go into something like UT14 clips, then we give another bullet into that magazine, and then I lose that sort of like snap functionality that I get with grand opening and then reload, grand opening, reload, grand opening, reload. So that's definitely something you can do if you want to go more for a sniper rifle that doesn't just shoot once and have to reload. In other words, a one-shot variant, and you want to go for something like an automatic sniper rifle or something that has a clip size of 8, then you can definitely maybe push more into the top tree here. And then you get, of course, the benefit of using something like empowering antenna and all of that, and that just further on, you know, ramps up your weapon damage even more. But the reason why I also went the sort of like split way here is because I wanted to double dip into the vulnerability effect that we get from exposing toxin over here and we get from exposing frost over here. Now by having both of these, you actually get the effect of this essentially ×2. So enemies are 40% more vulnerable when they have toxic on them, but they're also 40% more vulnerable when they're frozen on them, which gives you a combined effect of 80%, which means overall a lot more damage. Now along that, I'm not actually picking up any other major nodes except for the Sniper Master, because of course we're using a sniper rifle. And then along the way, I'm just trying to pick up here some health, so we have some survivability, and over here as much additional damage as we can get out of these nodes, and as well picking up sniper adept over here. I definitely think overall this is probably the area in the build where it's really up to you how you want to build it, but this ended up being the best possible setup for me that I could leverage, having both of these nodes, the exposing nodes on, but also still trying to capture as much additional damage as I can at the top here. That's it for the build and the video then. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. Let me know in the comments down below if you've tried to build a Sniper Technomancer or a Sniper any other class for that matter, how you set it up, or what you would change with this setup and what yours looks like. But other than that, it's just super important to me that you have a fantastic morning, a great afternoon, and a super awesome evening wherever you are in the world. And until next video, fucking cheers.
They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me. They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me. They want the best of me.